what is the aperture value mode? It's a mode on your camera, which is called AV. You have, a little wheel on the camera where you can choose different mode, and this one is called AV. And the whole idea of the aperture mode is that you decide what the aperture is, and the camera is going to decide what time is going to open the shutter of the camera. Now, what is the aperture? The aperture is this little piece of metal that gives different size of holes. This aperture can be small or the hole can be big, and we say we have a big aperture. So what type of sizes do we have? Well, when the diaphragm or the aperture is completely open, we say it's open at f1.4. When the size of the aperture is a bit smaller, we are at f2.8. When the size is a bit smaller, it's at f.4, and when it's really small, it's at f16, which is a bit strange because bigger the number, smaller is the aperture. Why is that? Because it's basically a mathematical formula. Well, if you divide 1 by 1.4, you get a size, and that's going to be the diameter of the circle of the aperture. If you divide 1 by 1.4, you get something like 0.7 or 0.8, and that's going to be the size of the diameter of the aperture. If you divide 1 by 2.8, you will get a smaller number because you have a smaller diameter. If you divide 1 by 4, you get 0.25, you get a smaller aperture. If you divide 1 by 16, you get an even smaller number, and you get a smaller aperture or smaller hole. So bigger the number, smaller is the aperture. Now, what does it do to have a big or a small aperture? Well, what it does, it handles what we call the depth of field. The depth of field is, this drawing is taken from the side. You have the camera, you have the aperture, and you have these trees. The very light green trees are blurry, they are not sharp. The trees which are dark green are very sharp, and the trees again are not sharp. So if you look from the side, you see that when the aperture is big, you have a small number like f1.4 or f2, so that means the aperture is totally open. You have a small depth of field. It's going to be very narrow. We say we have a narrow depth of field. Now, if you close a bit the diaphragm and get a smaller aperture, your depth of field is getting bigger. And if you make it even smaller, your depth of field is getting even bigger. So, now what does that mean to have a big depth of field or a small depth of field? What does it look like? Well, let's check it out. That's what it looks like. Here we have a big aperture, 2.8. The aperture is very large, the hole is big, and you can see that the status is sharp and the background is completely blurry. So it's basically an artistic decision. I want to get something sharp and the rest blurry, so I'm going to go for a big aperture, 2.8 for example. And your lens, basically, some lenses can only open at 4. These are usually more cheaper lens, and the more professional lens, you can open the aperture, usually they are bigger, you can open up to 2.8 for example. So this is the opposite. We close the aperture very much at f20, and now we have the status which is sharp, but we also have the background which is getting more sharp. It's not completely sharp, but it's not as blurry as this. So it's really an artistic decision. Do I want, what do I want sharp? What do I want in focus? Basically, big aperture are used to take portraits, to make it simple, and small aperture with big numbers is to take landscapes, because in landscape we want most of it to be sharp. Now, one thing you should know is that as the aperture is getting big, wide open, the quantity of light to get a proper exposure that the camera needs is very little, because the aperture is big, so the light is coming very fast. So look at the speed. The speed here was 1/640th per second. That's a light speed. And now that we have a close aperture with a smaller hole, the speed was 1/40th per second, which is still fast, but it's a lot slower than 160/40th per second. Because in AV mode, you decide the f-stop, and the computer within the camera is going to decide the time to make a proper exposure. So basically, you have a scene. Do I want to make a portrait? Do I want to make a landscape? You take an artistic decision of, if you want everything in focus or just something not in focus. And so that's, where you go f2.8 or f20 or f10 or whatever. And we're going to see a lot of examples of that later on. And the camera is going to decide the time. Now that's what the AV mode is. Next, we're going to see the TV mode, which is a time value mode, which is the opposite. Okay, the time value mode. The time value mode is the opposite of the AV mode. You decide the time and the camera is going to decide the aperture. So what type of time do we have, of speed do we have in a camera? Well, roughly this is how it goes. This is the fastest speed that it has, 1/8,000 of a second. Imagine how fast that is. You need to have a lot of light to capture a photo at 1/8,000 of a second. Then it goes down to, to 1,000 of a second, 1,000 of a second, 1,500 of a second, 100 of a second, 1/40 of a second, 1/10 of a second, and then it goes to 0.3 of a second, 0.5 of a second, 1 second, 5, 10 seconds, and 30 seconds. That's usually the longest. So this is very slow shutter speed. Shutter speed is basically the time that the aperture is open where the light can come in. We call that the shutter speed. And this is very fast shutter speed. Now, you see here it says freehand shooting. Basically, if you're at 1/8,000 of a second down to 1/40 of a second, you can shoot using your hands. You don't need a tripod. You can just shoot during the day, and that's usually this is during the day conditions too. You need a lot of light even to shoot at 1/40 of a second. So during the day you don't need a tripod. You can take proper exposure photo, but when the shutter speed goes under 1/40 of a second, you need a tripod. Some very professional photographer can get down to 1/30 or 1/10 of a second without using a tripod, but it takes a bit of training to really hold still the camera. But take this as a stable data and you won't get blurry shots. If you go under 1/40 of a second, then you need to take a tripod, otherwise your photo is going to be blurry. Now, this is an example of a high-speed photo. This was during the day, and it was only possible to do this photo during the day where I had a jumper, jump like this in the air, and I took the photo. I wanted to freeze him in action, so I took the photo at 1/1000 of a second. And so he was sharp, and there was enough light. The aperture was probably around like 4 or something, and it worked. And that's how I used the TV mode, because I really wanted to make sure that I could freeze the action. This is another example of completely the opposite. The speed here was 30 seconds, which is the longest you can do in most of the camera. And 30 seconds, look what happened to the clouds. The clouds got all fuzzy, stretched out. The water is silky looking. I love this type of photography. We call this long exposure photos. And I forced in 30 seconds to get that result. Next, we have another example of long exposure photo. I was at f.8 and the speed was 4 seconds. I like 4 seconds because clouds, became stretchy a little bit. The water started to be silky looking, and I like that in landscape. So that was one of the time I used this time value. Now, what happens if you take a photo, and let's say you're at f.7 because you're taking a landscape, and the computer says, okay, now I need 1/30 of a second or 1/20 of a second. You just press the button on your camera, you have set the f-stop, and the computer tells you, well, now the speed is at f30. You know that at f30 your photo is not going to be sharp. And that, believe me, will happen most of the time. So how to get around that? Well, we get around that using what we call the ISO, which we'll see in the next video. Okay, what is ISO? ISO is a way to solve a problem. What is the problem? The problem, for example, is you're taking a landscape, you are at f7, f8, because that's an f value that's going to give you a sharp photo, and you press the shutter and the camera tells you, well, the speed that I need to get a proper exposure is 1/10 of a second, and you know that under 1/40 of a second, you're here at 1/10, under 1/40 of a second, you're going to get a blurry shot. So we have different value of ISO on our cameras. It usually starts around 100 and it goes the whole way up to 6400 and even higher on high-end cameras. Now, every time, so the value goes like this: 100, 125, 160, 200, 250, 320, 400. On most cameras, that's, you know, the settings, that's how they are. Every time you go higher and higher in number, you double the sensibility of the camera, you know, of the computer inside, of the chip. The chip is going to be twice more sensitive to the light. So if you're at 1/10 of a second at 100 ISO and you put 125 of an ISO, now you're not going to be anymore at 1/10, you're probably going to be at 120, which is still too slow, but you can then go to 160, and now your speed needed is going to be faster. You're going to be at 140 of a second, and you will be able to take the shot. So that's a great way to not have to use a tripod and to be able to make photos even when the light is getting a bit darker, you know, inside, or, you know, the sun is coming down. You can just boost the ISO and you don't need to take out a tripod, and you will get a proper exposed photo. Now, that there is a downside to this. More you boost the sensitivity of the chip on your camera, more you get noise. Now, it's getting better these days. Camera handle noise a lot better, but I would say, you know, on high-end camera, you are like fine from like 1000 on. But on small cheap cameras, even at 200 or 215 ISO, you start getting noise. Now, what is noise? Well, this is noise. This was taken at 3200 ISO with a very high-end camera, but look how noisy it is. You know, it's this little grain everywhere. It's not a usable photo. So ISO is good because it can save the day where you don't have a tripod and you can still take a proper exposed photo, but you have to be careful not to go up. And if you have the possibility to use a tripod, instead of boosting the ISO, you will always get a cleaner shot. For example, this was a portrait that I did inside, and it was a bit dark because the room was not, you know, was just a bit dark. So I opened up my aperture to the max because I wanted him to be sharp and I wanted the world to be a bit out of focus, a bit blurry. The speed was 1 second divided by 50, 1/50th of a second. But look, the ISO, to get a proper shot, I had to boost the ISO to 1600 to be able to get that speed because it was so dark. The photo looks okay, but if we have a closer look at the photo, you will see that there is still a bit of noise. Even though I took it out in the software, you know, it's still a bit grainy. So I always try to avoid, you know, having to boost the ISO. That's my way of seeing things. For example, but it can take nice photo. I was in the middle of the night with this gentleman and I took this photo. I had a lens that could only open to f4. That was the maximum size of the aperture I can have. And I wanted to be at 1/40 of a second. So I had to boost the ISO at 1600 ISO so that I could get a proper exposure, so I could have one divided by 40 of a second speed. And and I took the noise out in the software, and it's kind of a usable photo, so it's still very useful to have this ISO option. Okay, the manual mode is a mode that I use quite often. Actually, I either use the AV mode or the manual mode. And the manual mode is very different from the AV and TV mode because on the manual mode, you decide not only the f-stop, but you also decide the time. You decide both. Now, when do we use manual mode? It says to be used when you need the same exposure on different photos. For example, panoramics, shooting events, creative exposures, difficult light situation. We're going to take one by one. So panoramics, you see here all photos have the same exposure. I wanted, because I'm going to merge all these photos together, so I need to have them to look exactly the same. So I went into manual mode. I dialed in f8 because I wanted a big depth of field. I determined that 1/200 of a second was, you know, fast enough to get, because it was during the morning, so there was a lot of light. And all the photos have the same f8 and 1/250 of a second. They have the same exposure, and they're going to be very easy to merge together. So that was very handy to use a manual mode. Now, how I determined that 1/250 of a second was fast enough, the way you work is, you start off by AV mode, you go to f8, you press the shutter, you take a photo, and you see that your photo, it looks good, and you look at the speed, and the speed was 1/250 per second. So then I went into manual mode, I dialed in f8, I dialed in 1/250 of a second, because I knew I would get a proper exposure, and I took these 5 photos. Same exposure on all 5. This is another example, shooting events. You know, when you shoot an event, this was an event I shot and it was like a lot of different light situations, and I wanted all the photos to kind of look the same. So same thing, I went into AV mode at f4, you know, which was the largest I could go actually with the lens I was using at the time. And I went to 1/60 of a second. 1/60 of a second, I mean, I pressed the shutter speed and I thought that, you know, the 1/60 of a second would give me a proper exposure. So I dialed that into my camera, f4 and 1/60 of a second. So wherever I was walking into the event, I had the same exposure on all the photos, and it made them like pretty uniform for the night, you know, and the customer was pretty happy. Another example, creative exposures. This was a scene when I was shooting straight into the sun, and that's the exposure that the camera was giving me. That was the AV mode version of it. I put in 7.1 because that's the usual value I use to have, you know, a sharp landscape. And as I was in AV mode, the camera tells me, well, I'm fine at 2,000 of a second. I took the shot and I wanted to see if I could go darker. So I went into manual mode and I dialed in f7.1, but I forced in 1/8,000 of a second. So, you know, it was a lot faster, so a lot less light came into the camera and it got darker. So I kind of didn't like that, so I tried the opposite. I dialed in 1/500 of a second and got a much lighter exposure. So that was a creative exposure. Now, this was a difficult light situation also. I was trying to make this portrait in the middle of the night, so I forced in my camera to be at 1/50 of a second. And you will see an example later on this specific photo, 1/50 of a second at f4. So whenever I was shooting, I had to go up to 1600 ISO to get a proper exposure. But whenever I was shooting, I took, you know, like dozens of photos of that gentleman. All of them were sharp because all of them was at 1/50 of a second, f4, 1600 ISO. And if I was not in a manual mode and if I was in AV mode, most of the time, you know, because there's a lot of light change, you know, if I point the camera a bit here to the right, it's brighter than to the left, you know, the speed would have changed all the time and would have gone too slow most of the time, even at 1600 ISO, and a lot of my photos would have been blurry. So that was great. I could get all my photos sharp because I was in manual mode and I forced in the 1/50 of a second, I forced in f4, and I forced in 1600 ISO, but there's a specific video later on that specific photo. Okay, one thing which is very important to understand is the exposure compensation. You see, what happens most of the time is when you take a photo, you know, you press the shutter speed, you press the button on your camera and you take a shot, for example, this shot in the middle. The camera is going to tell you, okay, here's the photo, this is what I consider to be a proper exposure. Now that's what the camera, based on the database, you know, based on thousands and thousands of examples around the world, is going to calculate the time and is going to give you a photo. And it's going to consider that photo to be a proper exposure. Now what if you want to get the photo darker? What if you want to get the photo lighter? Is there a fast way to do that? You could of course go manual or, you know, and change and force in some slower or faster shutter speed. But there is a very easy way to do that on all the camera. It's called exposure composition. The way it works is you have basically you press a button, so it's different on various cameras. Most of the time this is a symbol of the exposure compensation. You press that button and then on the screen, you know, you have this settings appearing and you can go left to go darker with using usually the wheel. You know, it shows you a little symbol of the wheel. You have a wheel on your camera, and if you turn the wheel to the left, your photo is going to go darker, and if you turn to the right, your photo is going to go brighter. And basically, so you set your compensation, you know, either to the left or to the right, and you retake the photo. And if you went to the left, your next photo is going to be a bit darker, and if you go to the right, your photo is going to be a bit brighter. And the camera is going to change the settings, you know. Usually it's going to, if you're in AV mode, it's going to play with the speed just to make the photo darker or brighter. For example, on the Canon 5D Mark II, which is what I use, I don't use this AV mode button. I just press the button and I use the wheel here And if I go right, it's going to make my little thing go to the right, and my next photo is going to be brighter. And if I go the other way around, it's going to go to the left, and my next photo is going to be darker. I used exposure compensation all the time. You know, I just take the photo, is it alright, or it needs to be a bit darker or brighter, and then I just press that button or use that wheel and change it right away. You have to find it on your camera, but that's very important, exposure compensation. Now, to finish on all these different modes, all non-professional camera have a lot of other modes, you know, where, you know, you see a sun, you see a flower, a man running, mountains, a portrait. What is this modes? Well, I said here, try not to use them if you understand aperture or time value mode. Because what this mode does is that it sets the camera for you, but very often it's not very right. For example, if you put it on portrait, you know, with the symbol of this young lady, what is it going to do? It's going to open up the aperture to the max, and it's going to take the photo because it knows that portrait, usually the person is sharp and the rest is blurry. If you put the mountains as a symbol, it's going to do the opposite. It's going to try to, you know, close down the aperture, put it around f7 or f8, and you take the shot. But you will get more creative and you get a lot more result just using the AV mode or the manual mode. I advise you to start by using the AV mode and you just play around. You know, you take portraits, you just open up your aperture, you take landscape, you close your aperture. That's it. And try to avoid all these you know, modes, because they will get you the AV mode will get you a lot better result and a lot more control on the light. Okay, so let's look at some photo recipes so that's to illustrate all what we went over. This was a photo I took early in the morning, and there was quite some light, but not that much. So I put my aperture at f5, and the computer, because I was in AV mode, told me, well, the speed is 1/80th of a second. I know that's, you know, faster than 1/40th of a second, so I went ahead and took the shot and liked it. Next photo. This was in Las Vegas, early in the morning, sunrise, same thing. I was at f4 and the speed was 1 divided by 100th of a second, 1/100th of a second, and ISO 100. I'm always trying to be at ISO 100, so I was a bit scared that my speed was going to go too slow, so I only went to f4, and I could have gone more on the aperture, because you see, if I went up to f6 or f7, the speed would have been like 1/150th of a second, which was still fast enough to get a sharp photo at 100 ISO. But anyway, that's how I took that photo, and I cannot like that. Another photo, so that's the opposite. I used a tripod for this one, and I wanted to get a long exposure, because when you car pass by, this is the Champs-Élysées in Paris, when the car pass by, they make streak of lights, and I like that. So I went the whole way, I don't do that often, I went at f22 on the tripod to force in the computer to a long exposure, and the computer told me, well, I need 4 seconds because you're at f22 at 100 ISO. So I was happy with 4 seconds because the car were just passing by, and it made all this streak of light, and I kind of like that. Okay, complete different opposite. A portrait, that's the usual value for a portrait. I took a lens that could open to f2.8, which was the biggest aperture I could have, and it was an artistic decision. I wanted the background to be blurry and I wanted him to be in focus. So I was at f2.8, the speed was at 1/200th of a second, and so I knew I would get a sharp photo, and ISO at 100. So that's a usual, very common setting for taking portraits during the day. Another landscape, I wanted to, I was at 4.5, because I'm 4.5, you still get everything in focus. The speed was 1/100th of a second, and ISO 100. So you see, every time we have landscape, we are like around 4, 5, 6, or 7, and every time we do portrait, we are on 2 or 2.8, and every time I try to be at 100 ISO. But we'll see some more example in later videos on photo recipes, so that you have a better understanding again of this relationship between the shutter speed, the ISO, and the f-stop. Okay, so let's talk about lenses. You have tons of lenses for every brand in the world, and it can get quite confusing. Just check out this photo. This is just all the lens for Canon SLR. It's a lot of lens, and it's a lot of money. So let's first go over a bit of theory, how the lens work. basically the lens, the notification, the numbers on the lens indicates how much do you go from wide angle to zoom, and it's calculated in millimeter. For example, we can say that this is a wide angle lens, so we would say it's a it's a 17 or 20 millimeter lens. And as it gets bigger, like this is not the case, but it's just an example of 50 millimeter lens, 100 millimeter lens, 150 millimeter lens. Basically, here you have a little glass, and further away this glass is from the chip in the camera, more zoomed in you are onto the photo. And so you have two types of lenses. You have lenses that goes from a value to another value, like for example from 17 to 40, from 40 to 70, from 70 to 200. So it's different, basically zoom factors in the lens. Let me show you an example. This is the same, I put my camera on a tripod and I just changed some lenses on it. First, I took a 17 millimeter shot. It's a wide angle shot, so the lens, the lens is only 17 millimeter away from the chip, to make it simple, and it's very wide, you can see a lot into the scene. Then I went to 40 millimeter, and now look, I'm less wide angle, I'm getting closer into the scene, and then I put another lens at 70 millimeter, and now I'm zoomed in even more, and then 100 millimeter, I'm zoomed in even further, and last but not least, at 200 millimeter, I'm really zoomed in. I can see all the details in the trees. And so that's basically all you have to know about lenses. Of course, you have different prices, and I'm going to give you some suggestions of what to buy or what not to buy. So here I'm on B&H, which is one of the biggest Photoshop in the world. You can find anything in B&H. It's in New York. And usually when you buy an SLR, you have a 17 to 55 or 17 to 50 lens, sold with your SLR. This is a wide angle to about what we'd say about a normal view type of zoom. So it's a good lens to take landscape. It's gonna get can get a bit weird if you do night shots, because usually this type of lens are not very quality. But if the only thing you do is landscape, the lens you have with your camera could be enough. If you want to get a bit better on doing landscape, this is the lens I've been using for 7 years to do landscape. It's a 17 to 40 millimeter. I'm using Canon, but you have the same one probably on Nikon and Sony and all the other brands. It only opens to f4. It costs about $765. And that's the one I have been using for the last 7 years to do 90% of my landscapes. Now, if you want to really get another similar lens but even better quality, you have more money, you can buy a 16 to 35, but instead of opening at f4 as the maximum aperture, it opens at f2.8, but the price is not the same. Usually all the lenses that open at f2.8 are much more expensive. This is $1,565. The only difference I could see between the one at $765 and the one at $1,565 is that I get a more sharper image with this lens, and the corners of my photo are a bit more sharp than in the one which is around $700. So this is based on your budget. If you really are serious about landscape, two type of proposal I have for you. You have other brands, which could have similar, like Sigma or Tamron, similar values, and you can go for them. They are very good. I'm just trying to give you a basic example here. Now, if you are into portrait, this is a lens I highly suggest, and you have all the brands make this one. It's the 70 to 200 f4 lens. It costs around $679. You can even find other brands which have 70 to 200 at f4, even cheaper, for around $500. They make incredible portraits and they are not that expensive. If you have a lot of money, you can take the same version at 2.8, but then it's $2,239. And to be honest, I have tried both, and I don't think that much of a difference, except for the stabilization. Each of these lenses have different prices. They are sold either with stabilization or without stabilization. For example, this one is $679 without stabilization, and the same one at f4 is $1,239 with stabilization. Same thing for the 2.8. This is the one without stabilization, which is no, with stabilization, which is $2,239, and without is $1,330. Of course, if you do, like a lot of weddings in church, you probably would invest in the one at $2,000, because stabilization in 2.8 is going to give you a wider aperture, so you can take in low light situation very nice portraits. But anyway, if you I don't think I will ever buy this one. I have this one and I'm very happy with it, with the f4 version. Now, if you have very little money and you just want to have some nice photos, there is one lens which I find which is incredible for the price. It's the 50mm 1.8. It only costs $100, $104. You have it in all the brands, and you can take some really nice portrait with it. You cannot get too much close to your person, because otherwise you might get some distortion. But if you take like half-size portraits, they are perfect. They are very good also for some landscape if you have quite some space. But the fact that it opens at 1.8, you can get some really nice portraits with very narrow depths of field. It's an incredible lens for the price, $104. And if you only want to have one lens, and you don't have so much money, and you want to have like a lens that does everything, I highly suggest you buy an 18-200. This will give you anything from wide angle to portrait in one lens. It's pretty light. Of course, it doesn't open, at 18 it only opens at 3.5, and at 200 it only opens at 5.6. So you cannot shoot too much in low light situation. The photo is not as sharp as all the other lenses I showed you, but it's kind of like, it's a good lens to start if you don't have much money, and you can do just about everything with that lens, 18-200. So there is much more to say on the lenses, but that was just some quick tips of a few suggestions if you are into landscape or portrait doing photography. Okay, your camera has two modes, two types of photos you can shoot, RAW files or JPEG files. I highly recommend it if you want to take some nice photos, if you really have a nice landscape or nice portrait that you want to keep, print in big and have the best result, to shoot in RAW. When you shoot in RAW, basically what happens is that the camera doesn't do nothing. All it takes is the raw data, puts it into a file, and then it's up to you to use a software to develop the photo, just like we used to do in the old days. And so you can decide exactly the contrast, the white balance, how warm or cold, or how much details you want to have in the photo. This is how you get the best result. To give you an example, this is the exact same shot. The one on the left is a RAW file, and the one on the right is a JPEG file. I tried to retouch them the best that I could, both of them. Check out how the RAW file on the left has richer colors, and it's got more detail. If I zoom in and compare, look at this. Look how much I have more details here in the RAW file in the sky compared to the JPEG file, where I have hardly any details in the clouds. Look all the details I have in the woods here compared to this, which is totally dark. The overall photo on the left just looks better than the one on the right. And if I would make a big print of that photo, believe me, you would definitely see the difference between RAW and JPEG. And cards today have lots of space and it's very cheap, so why not shoot in RAW? I shoot in RAW 99.9% of the time, and I really advise you to do so. Because believe me, a RAW file has a lot of hidden information, and by using software like Lightrooms or iPhoto or other aperture in Apple, for example, you can get the best out of your RAW files and make your photo look great. You will see that, some more of that, at the end of this course, where we're going to retouch some of the photos we took during the course. So voila. That's the battle, RAW versus JPEG. The only time I would shoot JPEG is if you are into sport photography and you take thousands and thousands of photos of a football club, playing, for example. And, of course, it takes a lot of more space to shoot in RAW and a lot of more time to edit them. So if you don't want to edit them, so you can program your camera to make the contrast and saturation as you like, and you just shoot in JPEG, and you finish your shot and you're done. But if you want to do some really nice landscape or nice portrait and really take the time to retouch your photos.
The definition of photography is writing of the light. It's the writing of the light. And better is your light, better is your photography. You can see in this example that we have a sunset in Paris that's pretty nice. It's actually one of the nicest sunsets I've had over the years. And well, we have a good quality of light, so we have a good photo. It's as simple as that. Unfortunately, usually the good light or nice lights is in the evening or early in the morning when the sun rises or when the sun sets. This is another example. You can see the quality of light is very nice. This is another sunset in Paris, and yeah, quality of light equals better photos. Here is another example which I like a lot, because this is a very common street. This street's got nothing special at all, and I think the photo is pretty nice, and the reason it's pretty nice is because the light was nice. So nice light equals great shots. That's rule number one. Rule number two is the rule of third. The rule of third is you have to imagine while you're taking the photography that you have 3 lines across from left to right and from top to bottom, as you can see here. This gives you 4 points that we call the 4 golden points. 1, 2, 3, and 4. The idea is that you put one of the key elements of your message across one of these lines and across this 1 or 2 more points. For example, 1/3 of the photo is the river and the bridge, and 2/3 is the ceiling. We usually say dead center, meaning if you put your subject in the center, you're dead. Here, we are not in the center. 2/3 of sky, 1/3 of ground. So the rule of third has been applied here on that photo. Same thing for this photo, where we have 1/3 of the ground and 2/3 of the ceiling. Now here is the opposite. 2/3 is the ground and 1/3 is the ceiling. So that's our rule number 2, the rule of third. Rule number 3. Find an element of fitness in your photo, something that will guide someone that will guide the subject. There is no 3D yet. Even if you have 3D in the movie world, you don't have it in the photography world. It's like workable right now. So many photography is pretty flat, so you have different elements that will get
Okay guys, so welcome to this little introduction on retouching. We are going to retouch 4 photos out of all the photos I took as part of this training course. I'm using Lightroom 4 because I find that Lightroom is the most powerful software to do retouching from far. The price of Lightroom 4 has been divided by 2 a few weeks ago, so I think it costs around $150, and if you're really serious into photography, I really advise you to shoot RAW and to develop all your photos in Lightroom because you can get quite some amazing results very fast and very easily. This course is not about Lightroom because that would be too long to introduce. If you want to know more about Lightroom, you can go to my website, which is called photosearch.com, and if you click here on the App Store link, you have all kind of courses. One of them is called the Lightroom 4 Quick Start. It's a 2-hour course. It costs $6 and it will introduce you very well to Lightroom, how to import your photos, how to retouch them, how to print from Lightroom, how to make web galleries, how to make slideshows, books, and much more. So I'm not going to go in depth into how I use Lightroom, but I'll show you a few things. So this is one of the first photo we took, which was just a regular daylight photo. And I'm in the develop module of Lightroom, and I'm not going to do much to it, but I'm going to, you see here you have some sliders. I'm just going to use this slider called shadows to open up the shadows. What that's going to do is it's going to brighten up all the dark parts of the area. Then I'm going to bring the highlights, which is the opposite. It's going to take anything which is very light in a photo and darken it. So I'm going to bring this to the left, which is going to darken and make the clouds better. Then I'm going to boost the contrast by going on the right. And I'm maybe going to change a bit the white balance, make the photo slightly a bit more blue by using the temperature slider to the left and adding a bit of magenta to make it a bit more reddish, more purple type of sky. That's just an artistic decision, but that's how it goes. The shadows, I'm going to make them, open them a bit more, something like that. And one thing that I love to do in Lightroom is to add some clarity. Clarity makes the photo pop a little bit more. Okay, so that's fine. And the last thing I'm going to do is go down here into post-crop vignetting and put the slider to the left. That's going to make the corner of the photo a bit darker, which I think works well when you do landscapes because it gets the viewer into the photo. So that's it. That's all I'm going to do on this photo. I'll show you the before. You have a history on Lightroom where you see all the things you've been doing to a photo. So this is the before and this is the after. It's quite a change, and you know, I could have gone into other settings, but that was just to demonstrate to you the power and the rapidity of Lightroom. Next was this night shot photo. So on this one, I'm just gonna bring up a bit the shadow so we see a bit what's going on. I'm gonna burn the highlights down, make them a bit darker, something like that. Then I'm going to use the whites and blacks. The way the whites and black works is that you press the Alt key on your keyboard and you move the white slider to the right until it's all black, until you see some pixels appearing, which is the case here. And that's the formula. And then you let go, and basically you have brightened up the photo, and the sun now has some white pixels in it, like 100% pixels. So maybe I'm going to back it down a little bit because I don't want these pixels to be completely burned, meaning they're at 100% white. There is no more detail. I want a bit of detail in the sky. And I'm going to do the same thing with the blacks. I'm going to darken a bit the photo until we have some points which are black. Okay, that's kind of cool. I'm going to change the temperature because I think I want to give an overall more warmer tone. So I'm going to put my temperature slider to the right and the tint to the right to make the whole thing a bit warmer. That's maybe a bit much, so I'm going to back it down. But I wanted something like this, you know, really where you would see the sun over a silhouette of Paris. Then I'm going to go into the noise reduction because there must be a bit of noise in the dark places here. So you've got a thing which is called noise reduction. I'm going to put this to about 30. It's going to take care of the noise. You probably can't see it on the video, but it does make a difference. And And then I'm just going to go to the same thing that we did before, the post-crop vignetting. Move this a bit to the left to darken a bit the side of the photo. And that's it. So let me show you the before. That's the before, the retouching. Okay, and that's the after, the retouching. Not much of a change, but you know, makes it a bit pop a bit more. Okay, next we have the night photo that we took with the city lights on. This is really always a nice time to take photos. I'm gonna do the same thing. I go up here, I'm gonna open up the shadows. That's the only thing I do all the time. And I'm gonna burn down the highlights. I'm gonna make the contrast pop a little bit more. I'm gonna move the exposure slider a bit to the right to make it a bit brighter. Okay, now the sky is still too bright. And there's a special feature in Lightroom that I love to take care of that. It's called the neutral density filter. This is this little icon here. Basically what it does is you can choose a function like exposure, and it's going to act on a gradient. So you see my exposure is a bit to the left, so it's a bit dark, and I click and drag and I'm going to make just the sky darker. Check this out. I'm going to boost down the exposure, and yes, that's it. See, before, after. So it's like a local correction. I love that option in Lightroom 4. I'm sorry if I'm going a bit fast, but this was just to show you, not to learn your Lightroom. I have a separate training on that. It's just to show you what you can do with the photos. I'm gonna move my temperature slider to the right to make it warmer a little bit, and maybe add some magenta also into it. Something like that to make it pop a bit more. I prefer the colors. And maybe I'm gonna brighten up a bit the exposure, slightly bit. Yeah, something like that. I'm gonna take back my neutral density filter, select it, make it even darker, so that we get still some details in the sky. Okay, and I'm gonna boost a bit the clarity on this one. I think it's gonna work fine. Make it pop even more. And I'm gonna go down here, same thing, and do the post-crop vignetting. Voila, something, no, that's too much, that's way too much. Just a little bit of post-crop vignetting, just to make some more details in the sky, something like this, around this. You know what, I'm not even gonna do it because it's already too dark here. Okay, so I'll show you the before, that's the before, and that's the after. You know, using raw files, see how the photo pops a lot more. Okay, next and last is our little portrait of our friend, my nephew Steven. So I'm gonna change the temperature. I think it's a bit too yellow, so I'm gonna go back to the blues. You know, go on the left on the temperature to make it a bit more blue. Maybe add a bit of magenta to take out the green. There's too much green in the light here. Something like this. Okay, I'm gonna open up the shadows a little bit. I'm gonna bring down the highlights and boost a bit the contrast. All right. And then this is, I know it was a 1600 photo, ISO photo, so there's a lot of noise. So check this out. I'm going to the noise reduction. I'm going to go the whole way to 40, and look how the noise is disappearing. But then I'm going to boost a bit the sharpening to sharpen a bit the photo. Okay, so not much, but it makes a difference. Maybe a bit of post-crop vignetting also on this one. You know, just to have more attention on our character, you know, our person here. And boost slightly the exposure. Okay, something like this. So, okay, we started here. And now, well, it's not much on the change on this one, and we are here. That's the after retouching. But we took care of the noise and various things. Voila, that's what you can do. That's just a little glimpse of what you can do in Lightroom. Thank you very much for following this course with me. I hope you learned some things. I invite you to check my website if you want to find out more training from me on Lightroom, Photoshop, or photography. I love teaching and doing this course. I really do hope you did learn something, and that it was, as promised, simple. And I'll see you on another training. Thank you very much for